All right, and welcome to the humanistic approach to personality. You know, the humanistic psychologists, you might remember that focus, right? There are two different foci, and one of them was a positive side of human nature, and the other one was free will. We're really going to have some interesting material to cover in this approach, but I really want to further flesh out the idea of the focuses of this approach and that idea of more the positive side of human nature and free will. The humanistic approach was very much a rebellion, a very rebellious approach, a rebellion against the other approaches at the time, like psychodynamic, like the biological and behavioral approaches, like the cognitive approach we have coming up yet, along with behavioral. So it's rebelling against many different things here. First off, it's rebelling against all the others as far as the focus on the negative. So in the psychodynamic approach, for instance, we looked at people coming up for therapy that had all these problems that were rooted in their childhood, especially those first 5 years of their childhood, right? What were those called? Great review question? Yeah, the formative years, hey? And, how that planted these issues in their unconscious that were affecting them in adulthood. What the humanistic psychologists are saying here, when they started this movement, very interesting because they said things like this. If you wanted to study cantaloupe, okay, would you go out and find the most rotten, faulty ones that you could find? Or would you find the most magnificent ones to study? Okay, so they're making it a point that there's going to have a different emphasis in their approach, which is looking at the positive side of human nature and looking at exceptionally healthy people. Okay? That doesn't mean that they're not going to treat people who have psychological problems, but that the focus is going to be a lot more positive. Now, if you, for instance, went to see a humanistic psychologist with a problem and you tried to blame your parents and because of something that happened to you maybe during those formative years, right? A humanistic psychologist is not going to let you get away with that. They're going to focus you on a couple of different things. First off, the here and now. Okay, they're not going to let you live in the past or focus on the past. They're going to say, that was then. What about now? You're an adult now. What are you going to do about it? If you don't like it, what are you going to do about it? And that comes to the other thing that they will focus you on is the empowerment. In other words, you have this free will, but what comes along with that is a personal responsibility, right? You can't blame it on others or the past or so on. But you are empowered to do something about it now that you're an adult. And, we talked about personality traits being on a continuum and that you actually have parentheses around your score indicating a range there, right? So personality is durable over a lifetime. It's if you're high on something, you're going to remain high, or if you're low, you're going to remain low. But you can move within those parentheses, and that's what they're going to focus you on and empower you for that kind of movement. And that may not seem like much movement, but can make a really significant difference in the quality of your life. Okay? The biological and behavioral approaches are also very deterministic, so is psychodynamic. All three of these so far are very deterministic. In other words, with the biological approach, we're looking at the degree to which your personality is affected by genetics, and you can't go and change genetics. You can't change your genes. And the behavioral approach, which we have coming up yet, but there's a really strong focus on the environment there. In other words, the environment kind of trains you, just like we might train a lab rat. The environment trains you to react in a certain way and to display a certain kind of personality. And again, very deterministic, what you don't have a say in it, right? Or very little say. And then in the psychodynamic approach, if everything was, due to something that happened to you in your formative years, well, you can't go back and change your formative years. So the rebellion of the humanistic movement is also against the determinism of these three. They said, wait, that might be true for lab rats, but that is not true for human beings because they have free will. Okay? And then you've got the cognitive, the rebellion against the cognitive movement in as far as the cognitive movement would try to use computers as a model for human beings, okay, for how the brain functions in a human being. And it's not that the humanistic psychologists disagree with this model, but that they narrowed it down more as far as what it is a good metaphor, what it functions as a good metaphor for. So let's take a look at this. So the humanistic approach, we've got the positive side of human nature, and they're going to be interested also in studying, finding some of the most mentally healthy people to study. They're going to focus on free will. That's unique to human beings, but it also comes with personal responsibility, right? We can't blame others, and you have to live in the here and now. That kind of responsibility. You can't blame the past or live in the past. All right, so we spoke about the computer metaphor, okay, in the cognitive approach, and I want to go a little bit more into this and what it was that the humanistic psychologists were objecting to and what they did agree with, because this is super interesting. Again, focusing on what are human beings, right? In what ways are human beings superior in their types of functioning to other animals? In other words, there's certainly animals that are superior to us in other types of functioning. Okay, but and how are human beings? What do we have that a computer doesn't have? Okay, and so the cognitive approach, okay, put out the computer as a metaphor for how the brain works in a human being. And, if you think about this as far as information processing goes, this is really cool. And it's a really great metaphor because I'll tell you something, there are basic processes in how your brain takes in and stores information and such. And the computer's a great metaphor for that. So think about this. One of the main processes is encoding information. So encoding it in a way that you're going to be able to make sense of it later, that it'll make really good sense to you later. One really good study habit to have is when you run across material from one class that reminds you of material from another class, or an experience you had, or somebody you observed, experience they had, is to make a note in the margin. Keep doing that in your notes, in your books. And what you're doing is you're encoding that information in a way where it's really richly linked to other stuff, which means more stuff it's linked to, the more likely you are to remember it and to have a more thorough understanding of it. Okay? So encoding is a major process. Now, how is a computer a great metaphor? Well, think about this. How many of you have ever downloaded a document from the internet and then tried to open it up and it was just all jargled text, right? We've all been there before, and that is an encoding problem. So the computer is a great metaphor for that. We've all been here before. How many of you have ever failed to save a document, forgotten to save it, and lost it because of that? Okay? Or didn't save it often enough and lost stuff because of that? Okay? And the computer's a great metaphor for what's happening in our brain, because sometimes people say, well, I studied and I really studied the material, but I failed the test. And when you quiz them on the material, they might have studied it, but they didn't get it into storage, right? So there's a saying that if you want to get an A on a test, you don't just learn stuff until you get it right, because you can quickly, easily forget it again. But you learn it until you can't possibly get it wrong, okay? So the computer is a great metaphor for saving, storing information, okay? And then another major process is recalling that information. So again, we've all been there, right? You've taken a test and you know the answer to this item, but for the life of you, you can't pull it out of your head, okay? And that's a retrieval problem, okay? And that is really equivalent to, if you think about the computer metaphor, storing something in the wrong file on the computer. So I told you that the more things you link those concepts to that are already in your brain, like an experience you had or you saw someone else have, or material from another class that's related, right? The better that you understand it, but also the more files it's going to be in, so that if you go and look for it in the wrong file, it'll be there. So you can see this is a super cool metaphor for information processing. But to say it's a metaphor for the brain, okay? To say it's a metaphor for the brain covers things like your personality, okay? And that's where humanistic psychologists said, wait a minute here, wait a minute. And they turned to the work of a British mathematician make their case here, okay? And so in something called the Turing test, Turing, okay? And it was a test of a computer against a human being. And here's the deal. You know, we know computers can do amazing things. You know, a computer can be programmed to play world-class chess. And what was the name of the computer that recently won Jeopardy over human beings? Okay, if you came up with Watson, you are correct. Okay, but you know the Turing test that that this British mathematician ran, okay, was proposed as a test for seeing how well a computer can simulate a human being in the whole now, right? So that would include personality, not just information processing. And what they did was really interesting. Imagine that you were a participant in the study. They would put you in a room, right, on a computer, and they would tell you that you are going to ask and answer questions. So you're going to exchange questions with two other rooms. And in one room, there is a real person responding to you, another participant in the study. And in the other room, there's a computer. And of course, that's the one question you're not allowed to ask them. Okay? But you can ask them other information, other questions, and your job is to see if you can guess which room is the computer responding to you rather than the human. And guess what? They all got it right. Okay, so the humanistic psychologist said, you know, there's a lot more going on here than information processing. The computer metaphor is a great metaphor, but just for information processing. So you see this idea really coming out that they focus on what's unique in human nature. What is unique to humans? So I think you're really going to enjoy these lecture segments.